Hi, I'm political analyst and Citizen Voice President Gary Dietrich to help you make sense now out of Prop 31, coming up on your California November 2012 ballot. This one dealing with budget reform in our California legislature. And, well, let me tell you a bit about what this would do. Three main elements, particularly. One, change from a 1-year to a 2-year budget cycle. That means instead of the legislature and the governor putting out a budget every year, they put one out every 2 years. It would also require that for any major new programs over $25 million, there would have to be equal amounts of either revenue increases or spending cuts. And that would also require performance reviews for state agencies. Helping us make sense out of all this today is Jim Mayer with California Forward on the yes side and Mike Harold with the Western Center on Law and Poverty. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us today. All right. Now, we know that budget cycles can glaze over eyes quickly. So we're going to keep this as understandable as we possibly can. And we'd like to turn to you as a proponent for this, Jim, to tell us why Prop 31? Why should Californians care about it?
The budget in California at the state really funds community services throughout the state. So it's vitally important that this be a process that is fair, that's open, that's transparent, and that people can participate in, and that it delivers results. But the budget system is fundamentally broken in this state. It's usually decided behind closed doors. People vote on it without knowing what it is. And there's no real understanding of what value it brings. So what this pulls together is best practices from other states that does two primary things in the state budget process. The first is it creates a guardrail to keep the legislature from making the kind of fundamental decisions that have put community services at risk. And that's the PAYGO measure. Simple as you can Google Barack Obama and PAYGO, and he does a great job of explaining how if you don't finance what you're trying to do, you end up in a lot of trouble, and that's what we would do here in the state of California. It's also got, if you will, some measures that are GPS. Long-term planning, performance metrics, systematic oversight, so that we actually focus on where the money is going to make sure that we're educating kids, protecting vulnerable people, and growing our economy. And finally, it has a 72-hour imprint rule. This bill that is so important ought to be public for 72 hours before anybody votes on it.
The budget bill.
Yes,
sir. A lot of people don't know that the budget is an actual piece of legislation, and so you're saying this would require it to be in print for 72 hours. Okay, why no on 31?
You know, we all care about having a really well-functioning budget. It's vital to our whole state's operations. But this state, over the last 3 decades, has passed effort, measure after measure after measure, constitutional amendments, protections, caps on budget spending, Prop 58 a few years ago. But instead of adding more transparency and operational quality to the budget process, we keep adding on layers of confusion, layers of rules that only a few handful of people understand at this point. This proposition, Prop 31, adds another new layer of rules and complexities around the way that we can deliver our budget and services. We think this actually will make it more difficult to govern, not less. We would like to see less of these rules and more accountability directly to voters through majority vote provisions. This act, unfortunately, reinforces the 2/3 majority around the PAYGO rules, which we think is not the direction that the state should be going.
Okay, Jim, let me give you a chance to respond to that because, you know, let's just pick up on Mike's main point. Is this going to make the process more cumbersome, or is this going to make it more accountable? How do you respond to that?
We really did our homework on this, and if you look at the provisions that are in Prop 31, they really come from two places. The first is, what are the best practices in other states that have been judged to be managing their resources really well?
So there's other states already using 2-year budget cycles, obviously.
Absolutely, and not just the 2-year budgets, but they're doing systematic oversight and they're doing performance metrics, and they have enough fiscal discipline not to drive themselves off the road all the time. And so this really was looking at what's the best practices in Virginia and Washington State and other places. The second thing we did was an extraordinary amount of public consultation and outreach, and we asked the public what would they want to see in these rules. It isn't about another layer of rules, it's about a different set of rules. And the public wants to make sure that the money is really well spent, and the only way you're going to do that is if you have performance metrics and you systematically review these projects and programs to make sure they're delivering.
Real quick, 30 seconds. Why is a 2-year budget better than a 1-year budget?
You know, what we spend in Sacramento is we spend 6 months waiting for the budget to be passed, and very little happens until then. And most of the budget doesn't change from 1 year to the next. And so the value of a 2-year budget is that you go through this in the beginning of a legislative cycle. What are we trying to accomplish in the next 2 years? How are we going to finance it? And then you can move on to other things, including doing oversight. One of the things the legislature never does is systematically look to figure out which of these programs are working. You can't do that unless you actually make the time time to do it.
Okay, and that's the reason for the performance review provision.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Let me give you a chance just to respond to those two pieces, Jim. Do you have objections to a 2-year budget versus a 1-year budget? There's a lot of people that have said over the years, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You know how much you're going to have for 2 years to spend, not just one. That and objections to the performance review. Let's just stick to those two pieces of this proposition if we can.
Happy to. You know, I think, you know, we don't have a principal objection to a 2-year budget. We have a principal objection to putting this process into a proposition. These are measures that the legislature can control and pass on their own. And in fact, there was an attempt in the last year and a half to try to meet this measure halfway by actually doing that. So again, it's not our objection that we think a 2-year budget is necessarily a bad thing, though, you know, that's not a perfect solution either. Things do happen within a 2-year budget cycle. And, you know, you have to have the ability to go in within that and make changes.
How about the performance reviews?
Well, and the performance reviews are the same thing. We think that they can be done with the legislature without the need to pass a proposition. This is just, again, our point is that we're passing more and more laws, but these are things that can be done by the legislature right now.
Okay, Jim, I'm assuming you're saying, well, if the legislature wanted this stuff, they'd have done it. I mean, that's probably, I'm assuming that's your point.
That's exactly right. The initiative process is there for a reason. When the government spins out of control, the public has an authority and the obligation to fix it, and that's what we've done through a very broad outreach effort.
Okay, and let's take this third point, because we've talked about the other two biggies, but this one about any new spending over $25 million would be required to be, you call it PAYGO, they call it that inside the Beltway in D.C., would be required to have with it an associated revenue increase or a revenue source or a cut. So tell us about that. Why is that significant? And why is it not happening now?
It's vitally important because we don't have any fiscal discipline in the state of California, and we have a very volatile revenue system. And when the revenue goes up one year, we do all kinds of things. We cut taxes, we make long-term commitments, we grow the spending. And then when revenue returns to normal, we end up doing all of the games and the internal borrowing that has created what Governor Brown calls the wall of debt. And so your choices are somehow you have to discipline your spending. And we didn't pursue a spending cap because we didn't think this was about limiting the size of government. PAYGO allows you to spend every dollar every single year, but it doesn't allow you to make a long-term commitment unless you've decided how you're going to finance it over the long term. That's what creates stability, and that's what ultimately protects other projects and programs from being cut in the down years.
Okay, so you didn't have huge objections, really, as you described it, Mike, to the other two provisions, the performance and the 2-year budget cycle. Is this really the one that you folks are zeroing in on?
The PAYGO provisions are something that we supported at the congressional level. It's true. President Obama's observations about it, we mostly support. The problem is that we don't live in the same set of rules here in California as they do in Washington, D.C. Our state has a 2/3 vote requirement for any tax increase. So as a practical matter, what this really means is our opportunities to increase or rebuild parts of the budget as we go forward are going to be reliant, one, on new revenue coming in. And that's going to be the only way when we have increases in new revenue that aren't already going to be swept up by repayment of outstanding debt. So the opportunities actually for us to respond to a growing needs of Californians, our senior population, is going to be limited in our view because the 2/3 vote requirement means we'll never get a tax increase to do this the way that you can in Washington, D.C. when we have a PAYGO provision there, where you usually see it as a combination of a tax increase and as a cut to some program. That's how PAYGO has worked in Congress.
2/3 vote requirement in both houses of our legislature, is that what you're referring to?
That's what I'm referring to for tax increases.
All right. Jim, let me respond to that because this has been a big debate in California over the last decade. Majority, 2/3, supermajority. Go ahead and take a shot at that.
Mike's right. It would take a 2/3 vote to raise taxes. That's true before Prop 31. That's true after Prop 31 gets enacted. And the reason why we didn't take that on is Californians aren't ready to do that. We polled it every way we could. We consulted with Californians. Until they think their money's well spent, they're not going to trust the state of California with that decision-making power. They're not going to change that. Ironically, they are more likely to trust. They want to provide ways to get money to the services that matter. They're more likely to not trust Sacramento, though, with making that decision. The PAYGO does one other thing, though, and that's that discipline that if you're looking at your programs, it actually creates an incentive for the legislature to move money from the programs that aren't working to the programs that really are, that are making a difference in people's lives.
All right. Real quick on that one. Quick response, and then we'll let you get some.
Well, that assumes that there's no overlay of politics that controls how performance reviews actually get measured, and I don't think it's quite that simple, and I think people with softer voices may lose out on that process.
Okay. chance to summarize, guys. 30 seconds each. Let me just go ahead, and Jim, you can fold your answer to that if you want. Why should people vote on Prop 31?
The people with the softer voices are already losing. The special interests are controlling the Capitol, and we need a way to have the public interest get represented in that process. And they're going to do it if we have a budget that says, here's what we're trying to accomplish, here's what we're getting for our money, and we can see those decisions before they become public.
Mike, why no on 31?
We believe that this will not add to the functioning and the stability of the state government. It will add a new set of complexity, make it harder for us to govern, and make it harder for people to participate in their government.
All right, gentlemen, we really appreciate your time today. Jim Mayer with California Forward on the Yes on 31 campaign, and Mike Carroll with the Western Center on Law and Poverty, No on 31. We appreciate that. Friends, these are important matters. California state budget, next to the one that's produced in Washington, the biggest one in the United States. Hundreds of billions of dollars ultimately. So you want to take time to just a few minutes, cogitate on this issue, take your opportunity to vote on November 6th. Make sure you're registered and go to citizenvoice.org for all your election needs. We're here to help.